writers don't come upon the first line as the first line. You don't write the first line in your first line. You know what I mean? You just don't. That's after you've written hundreds of pages and suddenly you go, that is a first line material, right? And you pull that all the way to the front again and that becomes the first line. And, a lot of folks who are at least starting out writing too, we don't realize that. They just kind of think that the first line has to be the greatest line they write. And I'm like, that's not how it works. You know, your first line's going to just let you just jump into the story, start telling it. You'll figure out the line later.
These are stories of outdoor adventure and expert advice from folks with calloused hands. I'm James Nash, and this is the Six Ranch Podcast. This episode of the Six Ranch Podcast is brought to you by Decked. That's Decked. If you don't know what that is, Decked is a drawer system that goes in the bed of a pickup truck or a van, and it'll fit just about any American-made pickup truck or van. It's a flat surface on top, and then underneath there are two drawers that slide out that you can put your gear in, and it's going to be completely weatherproof. So I've never had snow or rain or anything get in there. There's also a bunch of organizational features like the deco line, and there's boxes that you can put rifles or bows or tools, all different sizes. There's some bags and toolkits. There's a bunch of different stuff that you can put in there. But the biggest thing is you can take the stuff that's in your back seat out of your back seat and store it in the drawer system, and it's secure. You can put a huge payload of a couple thousand pounds on top of this deck drawer system. There's tie downs on it, so you could strap down all your coolers and your four-wheeler and whatever else you've got up there. It's good stuff. This is made out of all recycled material that's 100% manufactured in America. And if you go to decked.com/sixranch, you'll get free shipping on anything that you order. This show is possible because companies like Decked sponsor it. And I would highly encourage you to support this American-made business and get yourself some good gear. When does writing become poetry or not poetry?
Well, I like to think of everything as poetry, to be perfectly honest. And I don't even just mean, I'm not just saying that because I'm a writer. And by that, I mean the way that I just move about the world, the way that I see things. For me, it's always like through the filter of language. Mm-hmm. Always, I mean, even now, just walking in here, it's like, there's so many textures. I know the listeners out there can't see this, but there's so many textures inside this room, and instantly my mind starts to want to attach words to things. Like it's just, it's a way to. It does several things at the same time. I feel like in one way I want to honor the spaces that I'm in by just kind of acknowledging and making a sort of mental list of things I see, but also as a way for me to just sort of make sense of new worlds that I'm entering in spaces. It's the way I see things. It's like a lens basically. And so for me to sit down and decide, I'm going to write something today. Sometimes these things I'm not paying attention to necessarily. I just come to me in that moment and start to spill forth on the page. And I'm like, hey, I already knew that I captured those things in my memory a while back. If they make it to the page or not, that's a different story. But so yeah, I think everything is in terms of poetry, and it's just a matter of when I set it down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I took more poetry classes than any other type of class in college, right? And
Nice.
By the time I graduated, I felt like I was farther away from understanding what poetry was than when I started.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. That's not to say that I wasn't learning. I think what I'm trying to say there is that anything that you learn more about, part of that process is understanding how little you understand about it.
For sure.
But it is a difficult thing to describe or certainly to define.
You know what? Yeah, I agree with that out the gate. I think that a lot of the difficulty, though, comes by probably a lot of our conditioning, if you've gone through public school systems, or just a lot of the way in general people perceive what poetry is and what it looks like. And it doesn't have to be that way. And poetry really is very easily accessible if we are taught how to look for it, You know what I mean?
So how would you
And
teach somebody how to look for poetry?
right, right. So again, so I teach in a creative writing program, and I think a lot of writing programs specifically tend to like want to perpetuate this idea that poetry needs to be complicated, intellectual.
Mm,
You need to have read this and that and the other in order to understand it. I don't believe that that's how we should be look. That's one way to look at poetry. It's not the way. I think that poetry is something that all of us feel and are touched by in our everyday lives in one way or another. It's just that we're not attuned to that. We don't know that until someone points it out to us. And I mean, one perfect example as I was driving up this long, beautiful drive right now is music. I mean,
mm,
music is one thing. And I'm hearing the song playing, and I can tell you that there's probably nowhere else I can hear that song and take in the scene that I'm taking in as I'm driving this that doesn't I can't put words to it, but all of it just makes sense.
mm.
There's no words. I don't even want to describe it. I'm like the language, the music, the tone, the instrumentation, the guitar, and listening and watching the scenes, the green of the mountains. All of that to me is poetry, and it is informing. You'll feel different driving up this driveway than you will feel driving through New York City. You know
Of
what I mean?
course.
Like we don't have to put words to it, but we know that it's working on us.
Yeah.
And that's how poetry, I think, tends to work, which is I guess you could say it's a real instinctual way of life, an instinctual process. And I think sometimes we think poetry is stuck in the brain, it's in the head, needs to have these fancy words or whatever else, but it's not. It's something that we feel every day.
Mm.
There's something about that feeling, not just in music, but we're always seeking words for people we love, or a description for something that has hurt us and we are angry about.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeking poems inside of that, or we feel that too, and that's where poetry exists. It's those spaces that we don't think we pay much attention to generally because we're so busy trying to survive every day, but it's there and it's working on us every day. Even the tender way your child or your daughter comes up to you and I don't know, offers you a flower because she picked it out of the front yard, or offers you a dead bird because she found it in the front yard. There's some sense of poetry inside of that. I think that's the space where poetry lives, which is like, this is a gesture of love, and it's very tender, and yet at the same time, it's kind of weird. She's giving me a dead bird or whatever that is,
Mm-hmm.
So I think that poetry has room in those spaces. We just aren't trained to think in those ways,
Yeah.
normally.
Sometimes in some of these classes and in lit theory especially, I felt like I was probably put in a situation where I was having to look into it a bit much,
Sure. Yeah.
rather than just kind of see where it takes me and
Yeah.
then go with that. It is oftentimes for a consumer, for a reader, it's a portal into something else, and it has nothing to do with what the author was experiencing or intending, if they even had any intention in the first place. I think a lot of
That's
good
right.
poets don't.
That's right.
Yeah.
I agree with that. In fact, I think that sometimes, our mind wants to enter poetry the way you would enter, I don't know, just anything else. If you see a pamphlet with language on it, you want it to make sense to you in some way. And that's how a lot of people want to enter poetry. Like they can read a poem and think to themselves, well, I don't get it,
Yeah,
But
that's okay.
yeah, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not for you. Maybe that poem's not for you. Or maybe you're also entering it with this sort of idea of like a pamphlet. You're trying to figure out what the message is, when in fact, maybe it's not even about a literal message. Maybe it's like jazz music. Maybe it's just about the feeling of the language coming out of your mouth, or maybe it's the feeling of the sort of music or the rhythm that's created inside of a poem. Poems also exist like jazz music in many ways, where you can hear, or not even just jazz, just any instrumental song. You can hear an instrumental song and it touches you in some way. You don't have words for it. There's no words that are a part of it, but yet it touches you in a way. And that's I think also how poetry exists. Yeah.
Well, why don't you introduce yourself and tell people why they should be listening to you talk about it?
They shouldn't be. I don't even know. I don't even like hearing myself talk about it, man. No, my name's Tim Hernandez, and I'm a writer. I write in different genres: poetry, fiction, nonfiction. But the reason why I write in different genres is because I don't care about genres.
Yeah.
I just write.
Yeah.
And however the thing comes out, I'm okay with what that creature looks like, and I'll let others call it what they want to call it. That's my approach to writing, because for me, writing has always been more about. It's always felt like an urgent there's always been like this kind of an urgency for me about like how do I describe my situation. And it started for me, let me go back a little bit. In my life, I grew up in the San Joaquin Valley in Central California, all ag land. I grew up the son of migrant farm workers. My folks were farm workers. My grandfather was a farm worker. We traveled California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, the sort of big circuit. We did this big circle when I was a kid growing up, picking crops, all different types, berries, everything. And
So mostly based around harvest.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It was following the harvest, in
Yep.
fact. Yeah, absolutely. And then, and as a kid growing up and traveling a lot, we were bored as hell in the cars. And so my mother would read us books a lot, and my dad, it's kind of funny. My dad would just get sick and tired of hearing the same story over and over as he'd be driving. And he'd say, well, that's not how Goldilocks and the Three Bears really went. Let me tell you the real story. And then he starts spinning the whole story, something else. And as kids, my sister and I were the only two siblings. It's, we loved that sort of moment, that time, and of course I didn't know that would affect me or have any role in my life. Years later, it's dormant. Years later, I'm living my life, young adult in the world, and things start to happen, in my life, just, shit hits the fan, and as life will throw at you. And I felt the need to I felt the need to find words. I was like, what? How do I describe this? Or the frustration of not having the words to say what I wanted to say, or to speak to the powers that be, or to even just respond to my family at times and fill in some of the blanks. There was a lot of silence in my family. When they'd feel something painful, they would just clam up and not say a word for weeks. And that kind of thing really affected me, to the point that I don't know, but naturally, probably because I had storytelling sort of parents growing up, but naturally I gravitated towards wanting to find the words. And once I did, and I started to put words down, it felt good. It felt like medicine, to be honest. There's no other way to describe that for me. And I wanted to keep doing that. And then something else happened, which once I started sharing those words with people and communities and audiences, I'm surprised that I could talk about something painful and people start clapping.
Isn't that weird?
They start clapping, and I'm
Yeah.
like, whoa, that's a whole other level. And then they even do something different, which is like they start talking to you about it and then sharing their stories. And that blew my mind. I didn't
Yeah.
expect that.
It can be a lot to take on as well, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Especially during reads, dude. I've been in some situations where I read something that was like hurtful or personal to me,
Yeah.
and then people want to come up and then share their story. It's like I'm spent right now. I'm a raw nerve. I'm a pile of meat. This is I don't have the capacity to deal with my own stuff, much less yours. There's
right.
there's times when you can,
Yep.
but it can be
It's a lot.
It can be a lot. Something that I find very interesting about you, and the reason that I started with asking about poetry,
Sure.
is I find investigative journalism to be almost on the other end of the spectrum of poetry in a lot of ways, but still very much connected.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They're on the same spectrum. If you go farther down that road, then you end up with like, scientific or technical writing
Sure.
that is,
Yeah.
unreadable except for people who already understand the information that they're reading, right?
Yeah.
But investigative journalism and investigative nonfiction, there are some guardrails that are around that for how you can attack it.
There are. And you know what? I'm grateful that I don't call myself an investigative journalist or don't align myself with that. I take some of the tools from their toolbox and use them for what I do, because they have some pretty stringent ethics and, like you said, these boundaries around journalism that I'm too much of an artist to abide by. You know what I mean? Like my loyalty, if I have any one loyalty in all of this, it's to telling a great story.
Yeah.
And journalists don't, I mean, they have different loyalties, I think, different alignments. And then probably if you ask every journalist, they have a different answer, but they abide by certain rules and, ethics and codes that I don't, and one thing for sure too, is that journalists, for the most part anyways, are on a deadline. They're always a quick turnaround.
Sure.
They've only got like one shot to get an interview. Maybe they can return back for another second interview or something, but that's rare because the deadlines are so quick. In my case, I can investigate something for 10, 15 years. And
Yeah. And I apologize if I use the wrong word there.
Not at all.
But yeah, the deadlines are quick. Also, man, you just don't have a budget to be able to go back and
No. Right.
meet somebody else and
That's
talk
right.
again. And
Right.
that's a real thing. And
Yeah.
and if it's a story that is currently happening,
Yeah.
you've got to be on it,
You do.
because the national attention span is pretty short, getting shorter by the
Absolutely.
minute.
Yeah, absolutely. And and no shade at all to I would be honored to be a journalist, but they do the work and I don't do that work,
Yeah.
and that's out of respect for them. I say that, but I definitely have studied a lot of investigative journalists and their books and taken the tools that they use. In fact, the way that I write takes tools from a lot of different toolboxes. Journalism is one of them. Fiction writers are another thing. Historical fiction's another. I read these things and I'm like, I'm going to borrow this tool. That's pretty cool. Even like some radio and oral testimony interviews that I've done, like Studs Terkel, who's based out of Chicago back in the day and was just interviewing everyday folks about their stories. He publishes them. Great. It's powerful document of the time and the people he's talking about. But as a story, it can tend to bore you if you read some of his books. I say that with any Studs Terkel fan out there listening to me. All respect to them also. But it's important what he was doing. But as a story, it tends to just kind of be a little boring, to be honest. And I thought, but I like that technique. How do I use that technique? Interview people, use their own language, but do it in a way that creates a compelling story still. So I'm borrowing from a lot of different people in different fields, I think.
And that's perfectly fair, and it's great to be honest with yourself about that too.
Yeah.
The Six Ranch podcast is brought to you by Nick's Handmade Boots, a family-owned company in Spokane, Washington. This year, Nick's is celebrating its 60th anniversary of making quality work boots for men and women in America. I recently visited their factory to see the boot making process from start to finish. As a rancher myself, it was a rewarding experience for me to see, feel, and smell the quality leathers processed in 100-year-old tanneries throughout America. This leather is cut, sewn, lasted, and sold by skilled craftsmen before ending up on the feet of folks ready for a day of honest work. I'm currently wearing my Nick's Boots Game Breakers on the Six Ranch as I work cattle, plant my garden, build fence, and prepare for the upcoming hunting season. Nick's has a full assortment of men's and women's work boots to serve wildland firefighters, ranchers, tradespeople, military personnel, and anyone else who values quality footwear made in America. Visit nicksboots.com today to find your next pair of quality American-made work boots. Add a pair of boots and a work belt to your cart and use the code 6RANCH, that's the number 6 and the word ranch, to receive the belt for free.
I listened to a great interview with Ted Nugent, and he was talking about how he was inspired and used so many of the tools that he got from Chuck Berry. And these are wildly different artists, right? And he
Totally.
was specifically talking about Stranglehold, and he picked up a guitar during this interview, and he showed the process of taking Chuck Berry music and turning it into Stranglehold. And once you see it, then you can connect all that and be like, wow, that makes sense. And a lot of artists are that way, right? They're creative people and they're geniuses in their own right, but not everything that they do is original genius to them. Like they're picking up tools that they've learned from other people, and it's a great way to go. Like, why not?
It is. And you know what? I'll be honest. Like, I'm glad that we started this conversation with poetry, because I think, and I know it's because poetry was my first sort of entry point into all this, that now, you can do anything with poetry. Poetry can be all kinds of wild, weird things with language. And the U.S. Poet Laureate, the last one, he says, his quote is, poetry is whatever the poet says it is, and that's kind of true. It's like you've seen 101 ways to write a poem, and I love that freedom to utilize pieces of this and do that, and I think having that as a foundation is what has allowed me to play with all these different tools and techniques and see what I come up with. I kind of still approach writing as poetry, even if it's prose or anything else, but the way I see it and piece it together is like a poem.
Yeah. I've been trying to figure out how to even start to ask this question, and I'm just going to do it knowing that it's wrong, but I want to get into this plane crash.
Yeah.
And I think that it's crazy. I think it's crazy that we talk about the death of a bunch of people as the death of an airplane foremost, right? Like, that's a little bit nuts.
It is nuts.
Who cares about some aluminum, right?
Right.
But that's what we call it. We call it a plane crash.
Right. Oh yeah. Right. We do. You're right.
Tell me the story.
Instead of calling it like a something else,
Yeah.
you're right. We do call it a plane crash. I think too that goes back though to the fascination of what airplanes began to do in 1948. What they began to do for us in 1948. We're talking specifically about a Douglas DC-3 airplane, what they call the war horse. It was the workhorse of the war in World War II. It was a resilient airplane. It could take rounds of fire at it. It can, it would load up jeeps and ammunition, and it was just a workhorse of the war. And a lot of historians have said that the war wouldn't have been won without the Douglas DC-3. But for the first time now, after the war's over in 45, then we have a surplus of a lot of these airplanes, and so they start to give them a new paint job, take away the war smell outside of the seats, and then put new seats inside of them, and they started to use them to transport people. So to this day, a lot of historians will consider the Douglas DC-3 the grandfather of all the transportation flights that we have today. Because of that reason, it was one of the first airplanes that really was transporting people en masse. And so since all that's brand new at that time, there were several plane crashes that were happening right around that period of a few years. They were really starting to use Douglas 6 DC-3s. In fact, they changed the name because for the war it was called a C-48. That airplane.
Right.
It was after the war. They started using it for civilians. They called it a DC-3. So America has a fascination with a new form of transportation. Before then, we had trains and buses mostly. Whenever they were deporting folks, it was always either by bus or by train. And so now we're using airplanes for the first time, and the thing crashes in California on January 28, 1948, kills everybody. 28 Mexicans that were here working as part of the program that they had, that the United States had with Mexico at the time. They were all killed. The 28 Mexicans were killed while being transported, and so were the 4 American crew members, the pilot, co-pilot, stewardess, and immigration officer, all killed. So it makes headlines. In fact, they called it at the time the worst plane crash in California's history. And then the Mexicans were buried in a mass unmarked grave, no names on there, and not transported back home. They were just put there into a big hole in the ground, never to be heard from again. And that was also at the time the largest mass grave in California's history. So that was breaking some historical ground, that one incident alone. But I think that's why the fascination with the idea of a plane crash, or the largest plane crash, because that was pretty new at the time. There was a DC, was it a 6 maybe, I think, that crashed in Utah 3 months right before that crash in October of 1947. And that one killed more people. That was in Utah, Bryce Canyon. And it killed, I think, like 50-something folks. And the newspaper accounts for that one were way different than the one 3 months later. That one had profiles of everybody that was killed. It had the names of all 50-something passengers. It had most of their photographs of who they were. Talked a lot about them. It was just several pages in the newspapers. 3 months later, the same kind of accident happens with Mexicans, and there's no mention of any of them. Yeah.
So what was the national sentiment like, or the Californian sentiment like towards migrant workers in 1948?
1948, it was kind of it was like a bipolar situation, because on one hand, the United States had a deal with Mexico, how Mexico could be an ally for the United States in the war. A lot of the war at the time, a lot of our boys at home who were normally in factories and working, doing a lot of this railroads and all that. The war happened, and they ended up having to take off to go do the war, right? And so obviously a lot of jobs were left. And so what the deal was the Bracero program, which is let's bring in Mexicans in train loads and as much as we can to fill in these job gaps. And so they did. They opened up recruiting stations all throughout central Mexico. And the United States did this, the government, and recruited workers in, and workers all came in as part of the program. And pretty much if you just stood in the line long enough, you'd get a card to come work. Anybody could come work. So they all came in with their worker cards. The working visas that they had at the time were anywhere from the range of some were 3 months, some 6 months, sometimes a year. But then they'd have to, what they were doing at the time too, because they weren't sure how long the war was going to keep going, what they would do is, like, if someone's visa expired, like say for example, you're you're a farmer and you have all these workers and they got working cards to work here, and their cards are about to expire, but you know that the war's still happening and all that. So what they would do is they would actually tell their workers, like, let's send you back, tell them that this is the field you're going to come back to, and then basically just renew your card, and then you'd come back. So there was a lot of that happening, a lot of gray territory and all of that. If you stayed past your date, well, then you were here technically illegal. If one of the farmers were treating you bad and say just mistreating you, not giving you breaks at all, working you like a dog all day, not paying you enough, and then the farmer you heard on the other side of the highway, Highway 99, is treating his workers good, you jump ship and go work for that guy, and now you're technically breaching your contract.
Okay.
So there was a lot of this kind of gray zone happening. But for all the research, particularly to this incident, the workers were here with their cards and their work visas had expired. Their contracts had expired. So they were being sent back to Mexico at the time. It's kind of crazy because as they're sending workers out, the government's they're deporting some of the workers, the Bracero workers who are here. As they're deporting them, the farmers love the program. The farmers are like, keep bringing those workers here. They're good workers, they're hard workers, and they don't stop, man, and let's keep bringing them here. So, but the government's saying, no, we're sending them back. War's over now. It's 1948 now. The war's been gone for 3 years. Why are they still here? Let's send them back. So they're sending them back in droves now. But the farmers are trying to find loopholes to keep bringing them here. So that's what I mean by this little bipolar situation almost. So some farmers are telling their workers, hey, you have a job, come right back here. So then workers are going back and finding incentive to come all the way back again, So there was a lot of that happening. On one hand, not telling the other what it's doing. And that's where in the middle of it all, we have the 28 Mexican passengers who get in this plane, take off, crash, and everybody's dead, yeah.
Okay. Why did it crash?
The accident reports say that a fuel leak on the left engine. There was like a pipe that busted, basically leaked fuel everywhere, and it acted like a blowtorch, and it torched off the wing. When the wing fell off, it opened up a big gaping hole in the left side of the airplane. The plane spiraled down nose first into the canyon, spilling people out. Eyewitnesses saw that actually unfolding at about 5,000 feet before, up in the sky, and they followed it down to one of the ranchers' property there. Plane crash, killed everybody. That's what the reports say. But there's a lot of controversy around that nobody wants to tell me more about as I researched, because I showed the accident report. So right away, when that happened, they tried to blame the pilot at first. So then the pilot's family was like, hold on a second. Frankie, our brother Frankie Atkinson, was a World War II hero, decorated pilot who has so much experience in that specific airplane. He's actually flown 2 Douglas DC-3s during the war, one time over the Himalayas, where a wing caught fire and he crash landed that sucker and survived. And he's done that twice before. There's no one who's got more experience in that scenario than Frank Atkinson. So then they ended up, just to clear their brother's name, they ended up hiring their own investigation.
Okay.
And that cleared his name. So then the officials say, okay, Frank Atkinson's off the hook. It's a busted, leaky, fuel pipe. And but then a year later, the co-pilot's wife is in a courtroom, and she's shouting at the courtroom, I happen to know that plane was overloaded with people, and that's what brought the plane down. She says this in a courtroom, and she claims there were 39 people inside the airplane. Okay. The pilots I consulted with, they were 2 pilots who have experience in that Douglas DC-3. They read all these reports, and they said, you know what? It's just curious. I can't imagine how just even a fuel line would have taken off the wing. They said because that plane is known. It was known for its engines catching fire at the time, and it had a built-in firewall. And they said too, yeah, we've landed with one engine alone too, because the engines have caught fire in the Douglas DC. So it sounds pretty common. And they explain how there's this firewall that contains the sort of fire around the engine the moment it happens. And they have all these different things that they do, feather the prop and, shut this engine down and doing all these things that are made to do that. And that's why you're able to survive fires like that. And there's no way that fuel line would have ripped off through the firewall. At least that's there, and they say we can't. They scratch their heads and they're like, we can't figure out why that would have happened.
Yeah,
don't know why. And I said, well, Do you think it could have been that there were too many passengers in that airplane? They said maybe. One of them said, though, probably unlikely. He's like, I don't know, unless there were a lot of passengers, he said, because that thing was carrying Jeeps and what. He's like, there had to have been a lot of people. But here's something strange. So I'll conclude this by saying this. Here's what's strange is when I first started doing this research in 2010, the first articles I found online had the names of, they didn't have the names of all the passengers, but had the names of some of the passengers. And it said 3 or 4 people specifically, and it had their names, and it said their bodies were found on the ground in the crash site, and then it said that they pulled their identification cards out of their pocket or their wallet, and that's how they identified these three men. They give the names. Yet in the final report, in all the death certificates I've seen, those 3 men never show up again. You don't find those names anywhere again. So that led me to think, well, I wonder if those 3 men, I wonder what happened. Why aren't they in any of the other reports ever again? And in fact, you don't see that appear in the newspaper ever again. They don't mention it. It was just like within 24 hours they mentioned that. And after that, they didn't mention it again. And it made me think, there could have been a lot more probably on that. Who knows? We don't know how many more. So I always say there were reportedly 28 people Mexicans on that plane, but I don't know how many, to be honest.
Would, an additional 10 or 11 people really make the difference?
I don't know. I don't know. That's the question. I don't know.
And this is
I think it's unlikely, but
a very, very cold case, obviously, with a lot of aircraft issues and really all kinds of emergencies. Yeah. It's never one thing.
Yeah.
Right. It's the Swiss cheese model. Have you heard that before?
No, explain that to me.
Okay. So let's take a block of Swiss cheese and cut it into slices and then shuffle it like a deck of cards.
Yeah.
There's not going to be any holes anywhere, right?
Right.
But if you get the right combination, then these holes are going to start lining up. And if you have an overloaded aircraft and you have too many people on it, and you have people on there that aren't on the manifest, and then you have some other mechanical failure, then you've created a situation where all those things are insurmountable, even by a very skilled pilot.
And that's very possible. That's very likely what happened. Yeah. That's very likely.
It's also incredibly common during situations like this for the pilot to get the blame, because these aircraft companies, they certainly don't want people to lose confidence in them as a company, in their aircraft. It's much easier to blame the pilot.
Yeah, it is. And that's another curious thing you mentioned is that so a month after the accident happened, or maybe it's 2 months. It's like a month or 2 after the accident. That specific airline company goes out of business, dissolves the company, and within 6 months reopens under a new name. Yeah, so they were really trying to wash their hands of it all.
A little rebranding campaign.
Yeah, exactly.
So is what happened illegal?
Well, that's a big.
Is this a crime?
Well, that's a big question because when we say is what happened, we have to specify what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Is the plane crash illegal? No, that was an accident.
Yeah.
Is sending them back illegal? No, that was part of the contract.
Yeah.
That was part of the deal for these passengers. Is not sending their remains back home to their families illegal? No, I'm sure that was legal. But does that mean it's right?
Yeah.
That's another question. I think that, just to give you an example, that year, I asked the Mexican consulate this in Fresno County there where it happened. I had an interview with him early on, and I said, how come you didn't send them, these are your citizens, why didn't you send them home? Mm-hmm. Let's forget the United States government for a minute. These are your citizens. Why didn't you take the responsibility of sending them home? And then the first thing he said as well, first he said, actually, he cleared himself of it. He said, I wasn't even born when it happened.
Yeah.
That's what he said. And then he said, well, you know what? He goes, how would you have known who to send where? All the remains were just, annihilated. And I said, I agree with that. And that's what the reports say. Then who did they send home to the Atkinsons back in Rochester? You know what I mean? Who did they send home to the American crew member in Berkeley and in Long Beach? Because all of them, and in fact, they were probably the most, because they were at the front end of the nose, where, according to the news reports, it hit nose first, and then all the bodies went through like a sieve of all the gears and everything else. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? And if you're at the nose of that, you're not going to be identifiable. We don't know, but they were sent home back to Rochester, which is geographically almost twice as far as sending some of the passengers home where they were from. And that same year, and this is what I told the Mexican consulate, that same year, there were over 200,000 Mexicans that were sent home by train. That same year, you couldn't fit the remains of 28 more people inside of a box, put them in the train, and send them home. Like, why were they not sent home? And I don't think that that's any one system or any one entity's responsibility. I think anybody who was a human being at the time who had the power to do something about it should have done something about it and just sent them home. That's about human dignity.
Right.
That ain't about policy or anything else. It's just about human dignity.
Okay. So
Yeah.
the plane crashes.
Yeah.
Everybody's dead. Who's showing up and dealing with this is a very overwhelming situation for anybody to walk up on.
Yeah.
Yeah. What happened next?
So it landed on the home on the ranch, cattle ranchers who were the Gaston family. The Gaston family are originally from Oklahoma, and they had been there for a couple of generations now. That was their property. It crashed down on their property across the street from minimum security road camp. So prisoners had actually, I witnessed it happening. About 100 prisoners, I witnessed it happening, unfolding. They opened up the gates, gave everybody shovels and all that, and said, go out there and put out the fires. Prisoners run down the hill, probably about a mile maybe down the hills from where the accident happened. The Gaston family, they get all their family members together and go straight down there. They're the first ones to arrive, actually, is the Gaston family. Prisoners came right after that. The Gaston family, a man named Red Childers, shows up first, and immediately he's looking for survivors. And obviously, he doesn't find any survivors, but he sees bodies hanging in trees. He sees body parts laying around everywhere. Just a gruesome scene. And he steps back because the plane is still in flames. Part of the mountainside there is all in flames. And he just starts to try and help put out fires. More and more, obviously, people from the Los Gatos Canyon start to circle and hear about it. They start using the party line because they had the party line system back in the day. You would just get on the phone and you can hear other people's conversations, start telling them what's happening. News starts to spread quickly. And within that afternoon, the Associated Press, the United Press International, they're all there reporting on it. And they're reporting it, 4 American crew members, here's who they are, and then there are 28 deportees. And that report makes it all the way out to New York, all the way, from, as I like to say, from California to the New York Islands. And it lands on the ears of the folk icon Woody Guthrie. He hears about it in the radio, and he decides that he wants to restore the dignity of the passengers because they weren't called by names. And he's a big advocate of names. He had songs about the sinking of the Good Reuben James, the big Navy ship that got sunk and killed like 80-something soldiers. This is years before the plane crash. And he writes a song, a 20-minute song, and the whole song is just, what were their names? Tell me what were their names. Did you have a friend on the Good Reuben James? What were their names? And then he recites all their names of all the passengers for 20 minutes, So he was huge on names. So he was trying to do that, and he wrote a song about it. And never published it as a song, but it went on to become a song and recorded by everybody under the sun. Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, everyone. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that didn't get immediate traction, obviously.
Right.
Where did you come into contact with this story in a way that made you decide to work on it for so long?
I tried to push it away for so long first. I was like, I'm not working on that. I'm not touching that. I was working on a book that took place in 1947 in the San Joaquin Valley where I'm from. And that book was about, the great, what some consider the great American novelist, Jack Kerouac. Excuse me. Jack Kerouac's book On the Road. And he had talked about in his book spending 2 weeks in Central California in the agricultural farmlands with a Mexican woman named B. Franco. And he talks about her. My book was about her and her life. I was trying to find her at the time. So I published that book. It's done. It was before All They Will Call You, this next book. And so, but as I was researching that book, I saw this newspaper article come up. This is 2010. I see a newspaper article come up, and I'm doing research for that other book, 1947. And this newspaper article comes up 1948, a couple months later, January 1948, and it says, very dramatic headlines. It says, farm labor accident, 100 prisoners see an airplane fall out of the sky, kills everybody. And I was like, what is this about? So I started to read it. Now, here's what's crazy. I was at the right intersection at the right time because I've been listening to Woody Guthrie's music. Well, I've been a fan of Arlo and a lot of other folks' music, Woody's family, and I was listening to his music at this moment. And it was like, is this the accident that he wrote that song about? And I was like, my dad has always been a fan of like classic country. My father, growing up, he just played country all the time, so I heard all the Outlaws, and so I heard a version of that song by the Highwaymen when I was younger. Didn't know anything about it though. And so it made me rethink it. I heard the song again in that moment. I said, this is the accent that this happened. Holy shit, And so I started to read the whole article, and I thought, man, that's pretty heavy. That's cool. I'm going to just file that away into a folder and not think about it ever again. And that was my first thought. Focusing on this book. So I kept writing, and every time I kept working on this other book, I'd find information about this plane crash accidentally. It just kept popping up. So finally it was like, okay, maybe the universe is trying to tell me something, or maybe not. I don't know. I'm going to just put this into a file and keep all this stuff. And that's what I was doing in 2010 and 2011. Finally, in 2011, I think I finished that other book, sent it out to the publisher, and I just said, I had this itch, like I need to just go find where they were buried. I just want to go look. And I've never seen a mass grave before, and I don't know how many people have seen that, but when I went and found the cemetery where these Mexican passengers were buried, standing in front of a mass grave, it'll move you. It'll shift something inside of you. You can't help but feel for the people who that there's this giant patch of lawn with no marker on it at all, except this little tiny plaque. It just said 28 Mexicans killed in a plane crash, rest in peace. That's all it said on it. Don't know who they were, and I just was like, I need to know the names of them. That's all. I'm not writing a book yet. I just need to know the names, and that's where it's at, man. That was 14 years ago. I'm still here working on it. Yeah.
Okay. So how do you even go about finding out who they were? How do you get started?
Well, the first thing I did was, I should say this. I should preface by saying I don't have any background in investigation or journalism, any of that. I studied poetry, and that's like we talked about. But I do have one thing that we all have, I think, in common, and that's insatiable curiosity. I'm like, I wanted to find out who they were. So I said, what the hell, I'm going to go. So I went over to the cemetery office, the director's office, and I literally just drove that day and went over to the office, and I said, hey, who's the director here? And they said, a man named Carlos Rascon is the director. I said, okay, can I talk with him? Sure. Comes out, and I said, do you happen to have a list of names of people that you buried in the cemetery? And he says, oh, yeah, I'm new here, he says, but I'll look and let you know. I said, okay. About 2 weeks later, nothing from him. I call him again. I bug him a little bit, and he says, yeah, okay, I'll look. So one day he finally calls me and says, come take a look at what I got. So I go to his office. At first, he's like, who are you, a student, or what are you doing? Like, what are you asking me questions for? Right. And I was like, no, I said, I'm an author, and also a bit of a historian. I'm just curious, that's all. Mm-hmm. So he does. He entertains the idea, and so he shows me what he found in this catalog, and it shows the list of 28 people in this single plot, and it just says Mexican National, Mexican National, Mexican National 28 times. That's it. And I said to him, well, have you ever went to the Hall of Records here, the County Hall of Records, and asked if they have the names, since you all like have them buried here but no names? And he said, no. I said, you should do that. So he does that, calls me back, and he says, they gave me a list of names. And I said, I'll meet you out there. So I met him at the headstone, or at the cemetery, but right away I can tell that the names had a lot of errors, because back then during the Bracero program, a lot of the Mexicans would come across, they were in, processing stations. They weren't writing out their own names. They would tell somebody their names, and the typist would type the name and hear it phonetically.
Right. So it's an Ellis Island type deal.
Totally.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so a lot of the names were mistakes, but at least it was a start. And, long story short, that's when I began looking for the names, for the accurate list of names. Finally, one day, 2 years later, 2 years pass, I'm looking. 2 years, nothing. 2013 is finally here. And I'm like, you know what, hell with it. I'm not going to look anymore. I don't even know where to look, how to do this anymore. They're probably all living in Mexico. I don't know. And I don't have family in Mexico. I'm third, fourth generation, born here. So we don't have any relatives. So I don't have any connections to go back there. So I'm like, screw it. I tell a friend of mine who's a reporter, I said, hey, he's a reporter of a bilingual newspaper. I said, let me tell you this story. Let's see. It's a shot in the dark. Let's see if somebody knows anything about the story. So I tell him, puts an ad in the paper, or like an article in the paper. Paper is out for like 3 weeks. By then it's dead. Nobody's reading it anymore. And I'm like, well, I gave it a shot. All of a sudden, late one night, I get an email. Gentleman says, my name is Jaime Ramirez. I've had this newspaper article for the last 3 weeks. I forgot to call you, but I wanted to contact you and tell you that my grandfather, my uncle were killed in that plane crash. And if you need to know anything, contact me. And I went, holy shit, this is unbelievable. So where are you at? Where can I meet you? And he says, meet me at my restaurant here in Fresno, in the city of Fresno. And I said, where is it at? He says, it's on the corner of Shaw and Blackstone Avenue. And I said, there's only one restaurant I know there. I said, is your restaurant Ole Frijole? He says, that is my restaurant. Do you know it? And I said, my parents have been taking me there since I was a little boy. I said, I do know your restaurant, you know. And so anyway, I show up. He's the first family member, and he's the first one to say to me, do you have a list of the names? And I said, I have a list. It's got a lot of errors. And he says, I have a list too. And I said, what list do you have? And he pulls out this old sepia, rattled, torn apart newspaper from 1948. He lays it on the table. He says, I have this list. So what happened was a Spanish independent newspaper that was like a newsletter for just the farm working community at the time. They ran an article and listed everybody in that crash. So there's the first, middle, and last name of every passenger. And then it says, here are the names of their surviving relatives. Tells me the relatives' names. And then it says, here's the last known address that they lived in Mexico. And I said, I don't have that list, man. And he says, well, it's yours. I've been waiting for you, someone like you to come along. And that's how I've been able then to find every family that I've been looking for now. Is that list, that one piece of clue that the first family I met had.
Have you found all the names?
Found all the names. In 2013, we put them all on a proper headstone there. You know, it's a memorial headstone now that's there at the burial site, and we listed all the passengers, including the American crew members. All the passengers who died, we put their names on there, and the story of what happened. But now it was about finding their families and telling the stories of who they were. So that's what my first book was about. All They Will Call You was about their families and their stories. And to date, so far, I've been working on it since 2010. Here we are 14 years later. I've found 14 families of a total 32 passengers, 14 of them.
And were some of these families, did they have multiple family members like this guy from Ole?
You know what's interesting? So far, they're the Ramirez family is the only one that had two.
Okay.
Well, I shouldn't say that because the Atkinson family had two also. Their wife, Bobby, who was a stewardess, and Frankie, the husband. They were a husband and wife that were killed. So them two also. But aside from that, everyone's had only one member. But recently I discovered, and separately, they didn't realize, but two of the people on there were cousins. And the families didn't realize that because they just have never talked to each other. And it was like they found out through this research that they're actually cousins.
Yeah.
Two cousins were on the plane together, didn't know it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, that's almost comical, right? Like,
totally,
if we're going to whoop on a stereotype, like that's funny. Like, for sure, there's going to be cousins involved.
There's cousins involved,
yeah.
You know, there's probably a lot of folks who didn't know they were 1 degree of separation from each other, you know, in that situation. It's crazy. It's crazy, man. Yeah, and that's how it's been, yeah. And so it's been quite a journey, you know. It's been a real journey, yeah.
One of my roommates, when I was in the Marine Corps, ended up with a job. The Marines rotate you through jobs, right?
Okay.
So you've got your primary job that you're trained for. You'll do that for 2 to 4 years, and then they'll roll you into what's called a B billet, and then you'll go do some offshoot job.
Right. Okay.
And one of his jobs was to go to places in the Pacific like Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, and try to find and identify remains of Marines who are still there and try and get them back to the States, back to their families.
Wow.
And that's an ongoing effort still from the same time period.
Yeah. Wow. Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Has that been written about? Like, I mean,
I don't know.
Like to read up on
do you
that.
want to write another book?
Yeah, we write a book in collaboration, my friend. I was like, but yeah, no, that's that's important work. You know, it's important work for closure for their families and also to honor the dead. You know what I mean? Like, everyone deserves to at least die with their name on a headstone. You know, at the very least. You know, no matter who you are, what your beliefs are, don't matter. You at least deserve to die with your name on a headstone.
Why is that important?
You know, I feel like because it's a representation that we once existed. And it's important that we know that because our names and who we are is the link in the chain to all of our past, you know, and we need to know where we come from, the lineage, the people we come from, the struggles they've come from. That's our story, you know. To give you an example, back in the Roman Senate, way back in the days, the Romans, you know, they're never short of creativity for ways to torture people, you know. So the Roman Senate had different ways of condemning somebody for their crimes. And one of them was damnatio ad bestias, which was death by beasts, and so if you did something wrong, they'd put you in the center ring and before the audience, let the lions have their way with you. That was one of the ways, but they didn't consider that to be the worst. The one that they considered to be the worst was damnatio memoriae, which is death by erasure. So they didn't only kill you, but then they erased every bit of evidence that you ever existed, so nobody could come find you, and so there was a break in the link of the chain. And so, just by contrast, this is why our names and the fact that we existed, that evidence is so important to us. And so, yeah, and it's also about just basic, it's about human dignity at its most basic. You lived, you might have been a flawed creature like most of us, or whatever it is, or whatever your beliefs, but at the end of the day, you were somebody's brother, you were somebody's sister, somebody's father. You had your people, and that's it.
I can think of one case where there's tremendous power in the anonymity of death, and it's one that we're all vaguely familiar with,
Yeah.
but not too specifically. That's the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a very important national monument. And it's such a solemn place and such a sacred duty for the troops that continue to guard that tomb 24/7. My friend Tim Butler created the pistols that they carry. So when the pistol contract changed in the military, then those guards of the tomb had to have that same pistol, but they get special ones, right?
Wow.
And he incorporated some script that is inside those guns in places that only the people that carry them will ever see. There's granite from the mountains of New Hampshire, where the company was based that made these guns. There's parts like that came from dust from the World Trade Center.
Yep. Yep.
What I think is special about the tomb is that we feel like it's part of all of us, right? Whoever that is us too. And I think it is an interesting contrast to what we're talking about here, which is the nature of wanting to be remembered, having made a difference, having the sense of being significant.
Yeah.
And I struggle with that a little bit myself. If I think about the size of the universe, if I think about how brief this moment of time is.
Yeah.
On one hand, it makes it feel very special,
right,
to be able to exist now, and then on the other, it's like, it probably doesn't really matter.
Right. I struggle with that too.
Yeah,
I do. Yeah.
It's hard not to if you think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I absolutely struggle with that, and that's not something I have any answer to. You know what I mean? And I don't know if I'll ever have an answer for that. But you're absolutely right, because as you're talking about all of the sort of ingredients that go into those memorials that you're talking about there, like the dust from the towers, twin towers, things like that. What we're talking about really is symbolism. All these things are powerful symbols as a way to honor the people, the fallen. Is that going to change lives? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like, is this headstone, now that we've put all their names on it, is it going to, I'm sure it matters to the families, but I keep asking myself, like, in the big picture, is it changing anything? Is it affecting lives in some way? Like,
does it need to?
Does it need to?
Is that the goal?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I think for me, the quickest answer that I pull from is, it's the least we can do to honor human lives.
Sure.
That's it.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's just enough.
It's noble.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly, it's noble what you've done.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Gosh, can you imagine the guy that had to dig the hole?
Yeah, there's photographs of that. Several guys digging that hole. But
really?
Yeah.
Brutal.
Yeah, they were. Yeah.
Were they Mexican?
Here's the thing. I don't know if they were all Mexican, but I do know that one of them was Mexican. And he. So there's a man who contacted me. His daughter actually contacted me. I want to say a couple of years ago, and she says, my dad was there helping dig the hole that day. And I said, I'd love to speak to your dad, And she says, yeah, he'll speak to you. She says he was a boy. He was probably about 12 years old at the time, but it was his father who was really the man digging the hole.
Sure.
And she said, but he knows that whole story. He remembered it vividly. I'm sure he'll talk to you. And for some reason, man, it's a mystery. He just decided to not talk with me. I don't know why, but Yeah.
It was probably a horrible experience.
Could have been.
Yeah.
Very probably. That's probably it.
Yeah. I bet he was scared.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
probably right. Yeah, probably scared. Probably could have been, just a real impactful experience for him. Doesn't want to revisit it.
Yeah.
Why should he? Just so some guy could write a story about it?
Yeah. To,
No
you know,
thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. Literally dig up,
Yeah, man.
what might have been the worst day of his life.
Yeah, and you know what? That raises a good point. Like I've had to really check myself in this whole thing because it's like, I there's a moment where I'm like, I'm going to be the hero. I'm going to put names on a headstone and go find the stories and write about them. This sort of naive approach to all this. And it was one time when I went all the way to Jalisco, Mexico, met one of the families, sat there with them all day, man, recorded interviews, talked with them all day long. They knew I was an author coming in. At the very end of the day, we're all exhausted. We're all talked out. And they say, Mr. Hernandez, can you turn off the cameras? And because I had a little digital camera and some audio equipment because it's history. I want to get all this down.
Mm-hmm.
It's important. In my mind, I'm thinking it's important.
Right.
So I'm getting it all. And they said, can you turn off all the equipment? I said, sure. So I turned it off. And they said, we would like for you to not put this in your book. And I said, what?
Yeah.
I was like, wait, what? And then they explained to me their good reasonings and all that. And the family was all gathered there, and they kind of all were looking at me saying, yeah, we don't want it in your book, And I thought, damn, I never thought this would happen. I didn't expect that. Taught me a lot about the way I approach families, It's not my story. It's their story. They decide what they want to do with it. So I have to respect that.
It's tricky, and there's a lot of power in the space between words, right?
Yeah.
Anybody that writes well figures that out at some point.
Yeah.
And those gaps are incredibly important. But it's a precarious thing when you're dealing with the human element of that. I've had it happen on this podcast.
Yeah.
A lot, right? And I think that the most interesting things that have ever been said on this show and the thousands of hours of recording have been things that people later said, can you edit that out? It's like, oh, yes, I can. Of course I can.
Yeah.
But I wish that you would reconsider.
Yeah.
Or because this is powerful stuff.
Yeah.
But power moves in every direction.
It does, man. It really does. And I think that's what I learned. That's the lesson right there. That's well articulated the way you said that. Power moves in every direction. I think I went into it thinking power was going to move in this one direction. Right. And it taught me, no, it moves this way too, my friend.
It's a 4-dimensional world.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
It absolutely is, And so, I approach the whole thing now differently, So, and, actually, here's the thing is I still try to weasel around it. Mm-hmm. What I told the families was I said, listen, let me write it and I'll show it to you. If you don't like it, then I won't publish it.
Yeah.
But let me just write it first and you read what I'm going to write first. I did. And they looked at it and they said, wow, we feel very honored. It's wonderful. Don't publish it.
Yeah.
So I went, all right, I get it. That's fair enough.
And that's exactly what it is. It's fair enough.
Yeah, fair enough.
What are you working on now?
Man.
What brings you to Wallowa County?
The subject of love at Fish Trap. That's what brings me. Fish Trap writing.
What is Fish Trap? We're talking to a global audience.
Okay, good.
Of course,
good,
I know what it is, but
well, Fish Trap is basically it's a writer's retreat, for lack of a better word. It's a gathering of writers and folks who want to learn about writing. So Fish Trap organization gets writers from all across the country, from different backgrounds, different experiences, different genres, brings them here, maybe about 8 of us, and then we teach folks who want to become writers. Mm-hmm. And that's it. And we do it here in this beautiful setting here in the Wallowas, and it's a natural setting, gorgeous, and we spend just an entire week, man, just pushing out the whole writing thing, workshops and all that kind of stuff. And you know what I love about it too is it's for people of all range of experience, people who just never written a thing in their lives but want to be writers. And others who have degrees in writing and are still trying to work on another book. So we have all sort of range of experience, which is why I love coming back here. Every year they have a theme, and this year's theme is love, which is a big all-encompassing theme. You can go anywhere with that, obviously. But
that's about as easy to define as poetry.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly, right? So, so I came back to teach. This is my 3rd year. They invited me in 2018 and 22. And then this year, this is my 3rd year here. So, yeah, I love coming back here and teaching and being part of it. And also it gives me an excuse to get out of hot El Paso. Mm-hmm. Although I got to say, man, this year's been the warmest here up here.
Dude, you ain't kidding. I was down in the canyons this week, and it was 102 in the shade.
What?
And we were we were spearfishing, and it was 67 degrees in the water. A couple guys had brought wetsuits, and man, the wetsuits got abandoned quick.
Yeah.
We were just getting in the river to survive. It's brutal.
Yeah, man, it's the hottest it's ever been here that I've experienced in times I've come. Yeah, but that's what Fish Trap is. That's what brings me out here.
So are your students wanting to write for publication, or are they wanting to learn how to write for catharsis or for communication?
A little bit of both, catharsis and publication. I think most of them have their eyes on publishing eventually. Some are at a place where they don't believe that's possible for themselves.
Yeah.
And others are like, yeah, I've done it before, but I just hit a slump and I can't get moving. So they're just at different ranges of what they're coming, their purpose for being there. But I think, honestly, and this is just my experience across the board, a lot of people are just looking for permission, like to write their story, to say, I have something to say. And they're like looking at it saying, is this worth saying? Is it publishable? Is it? And I'm like, yeah, you know what? Publishable or not, like say it because you got to say it. Write it because you got to write. And we'll figure that other part out later. Let's just stick with like what we got to say first. And so I think a lot of encouragement, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I've always felt like it's a bit juvenile to write about yourself, and I don't mean juvenile in a negative way.
Sure.
I mean young in your writing experience. Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily. No, not necessarily. I can see though the inclination towards that. I think a lot of people initially will enter writing by writing about themselves. I think though that, the saying goes, every portrait is a self-portrait, and I feel like even if we're not writing about ourselves and we're not the subject, we're still writing about ourselves.
It's our lens. Yeah.
It's our lens. We can't avoid that, and that's something that I've been talking a lot about this week, because this week I'm actually here this time to teach about memoir writing. So it is about writing about yourself. It has the word me in there. It starts off with the word me. Memoir starts off with me. And so it's like, but one of the things that I'm talking about is their concerns are like, well, how can I write about somebody else but not put words in their mouth or not look at them from my perspective? And I'm like, that's unavoidable. It's all from your perspective, because even the conversation you decide to write about is a choice that you're curating as you're writing. It's unavoidable. Everything we write is a reflection of ourselves. Everything we choose to focus our lens on is a reflection of us. The best we can do is do it with ethics, do it in a way that, I think pays honor to another person, as much as possible.
Memoirs are interesting, and it's interesting at what stage of your life you feel inclined to start it. When we were down here in this river canyon this week, three of us were about my age, right?
Yeah.
Right, like late 30s, and then another gentleman was in his 60s, and we were talking about which way we were looking when we were in the canyon. Were we looking downriver? Were we looking upriver? The three younger guys were all looking downriver. The old guy was looking upriver, and I thought that was interesting psychology and an interesting metaphor. He was looking at where the water had come from, and we were looking at where it was going.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So when you say that there's poetry in all things, I think that there is if you're looking for it.
Yeah.
And I certainly found it there in that conversation, in that place.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that, that's how a lot of magic works. It's if we're looking for it, we see it. And if we're not, then, our lives are something else. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's how spirituality works. That's how a lot of things work. Our beliefs, sometimes, it depends on what we want to believe in, what we choose to believe. And that's what works on us or doesn't,
So if a person's writing, they've gone through their own process, they've edited, they feel like they've got a relatively polished product. When do they think, well, maybe it's time that I start to look at publication?
I think that at some point you just got to throw it and see if it sticks. You got to just put it out there, because the truth of the matter is it's never going to feel ready.
Where are you putting it out there? Are you trying to write a couple lines on Twitter or Instagram? Or
Well, no, I mean like to get it published as a book.
Yeah.
Sending it to a publisher, and one of the ways that a lot of students will do it is they'll find books that resonate with them, or books by authors that kind of write along the lines of what they're writing. They look at who published that book, and then they approach that publisher. And, but a lot of times too, writers we'll get, man, writers are the best procrastinators, because we can find, like, cutting the lawn, is never as important until the moment you try to sit down and write a book.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, that procrastination gets celebrated in a lot of ways.
Does it? Tell me. What do you mean?
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
if I say, I've been writing this book, I've been working on it for 20 years.
Yeah.
I write 2 lines in the morning, 2 lines in the evening, and then I edit one of those before I go to bed, something like that. People would be like, "Wow, that's amazing," right? If I said, "Yeah, I've been working on building this fence for the last 20 years," I'd be like, "Why don't you just do it? Why don't you just get that done?"
That's right. You're right. That's exactly true, man. That's right. Procrastination for writers is celebrated.
In some ways it is,
So yeah, well, no wonder anyone finishes a book ever, It's like, how the hell? Yeah, no, that's true, man. Absolutely true. 100% true. Yeah, I've been contemplating this one sentence for a month. Wow, that must be a great sentence.
Wow, you've really been slugging it out.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope it doesn't suck.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. It better be a damn good sentence, Man, no, that's true, Somebody was asking me something about artist block or writer's block and all that. And I said, you know what? I don't believe in writer's block.
Yeah,
I said, Stephen King has a great quote. He says, listen, inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us get up and do the work.
Yeah.
And that's it. You just wake up every morning, pound it out. Whether it's crap, whether it's great, whatever, it doesn't matter. You're just pounding out words. And eventually you have enough stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no real block.
No.
There's just fear. And you might not be able to organize your thoughts or articulate it into your hand, but you can physically write something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And oftentimes, if you're willing to face that fear long enough to know that first thing that you write is going to be crap.
Yeah.
It's like, well, just keep writing crap until it's not.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if we're not showing up, if we're not putting our behind in the saddle every day and writing the stuff, what are we waiting for? We're waiting for a great line to appear in our head one day, and then I'm going to write it down. Like, no, you just got to put stuff out there, see what you got, and build on it. It's just like that. You're just building something. You know. Yeah.
How do you balance writing what you want to write versus what you think your audience wants to read?
I don't think about at all what my audience wants to read when I think about the subject I want to write. Something has to really speak to me in order for me to invest my time. It has to be something that either, man, I'm like, I don't have an answer for it, and it's just been there and I want to discover. Or if it's like, man, I have a big fear of this, like, what is that about? And then I want to dig deeper. So then I find myself writing about something, or I want to come to a new understanding about something that I just don't understand. I could be like, why is this person over here acting this way? Or why have they been like that their whole lives or whatever? I want to get to something that just speaks to me. So that's how I enter a subject to write. I'm not even thinking at that point, of a audience or possible even a publisher at that point. I'm just like, let's see what this is about for a while. I'm going to spend some time with it, because for me, writing really is about my own, not just catharsis, but it's about my own education. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to teach myself about new things, things I've never learned about. Like, I mean, how do I know all this stuff about Douglas DC-3 airplanes? I wouldn't have cared about it once upon a time. I never thought, now I fly. I feel safer in an airplane this today than I ever felt before in my life, because I know a lot of stuff about airplanes now that I didn't prior to that. But I love learning and educating myself about things. So that's how I enter the book or the subject. If at some point, probably about halfway through after working on it for a couple of years or something, then I start to realize, this could actually be a book. Or sometimes, and I have a couple of books that never made it, that never became anything. I'm like, no, I learned a lot, but it's not going anywhere. So, yeah.
Do you write on paper? Do you write on a laptop?
I type.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I also journal.
Like typewriter type?
No, I'm not that old school.
Yeah.
But no, I use my computer. But I actually, I journal every day. I write in a journal every day. And sometimes, and again, it's just for the practice of writing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's just total crap. It's mundane. It's like, here's the date. I'm drinking coffee. I'm sitting here listening to this song. It's cold outside. That's it. And that's my day. That's all I write for the day. But I'm writing something every day. But when I have enough stuff or an idea for something, I actually will usually start by typing up, like say a book idea comes to me, I'll type it up in a Word document on my laptop, and I'll just leave it there for weeks, months, whatever. If it keeps coming back to me, sort of calling me other ideas around it, if it just keeps pulling at me, then I start to listen to it. And so at any given time, like right now, I probably have about 13 different folders that have possible book ideas. One of them is speaking to me more than the others right now, and that's the one that seems to be gaining some momentum. Yeah.
What's the hardest line to write in a book?
The last line. For me, it's the last line. Yeah, it's always the last line. First line's easy. The last line is difficult. It's like leaving a meal. Sometimes you walk away from a great steak, and then someone says, "Do you want some dessert?" And I'm like, "No, you know what? I'm gonna let that steak linger for a little while because I still carry that essence of it with me, and it was damn good. So I'm just gonna hang with that for a little bit. I don't want to change the flavor yet in my mouth, and that's why I feel the last line does. The last line in a book is like just having a great meal, and you want that person to leave with that resonating in their being and who they are in their mind. And I want them to carry that with them for a few days, if possible. Share that kind of thing. Yeah.
Which is the most powerful line in a book?
The most powerful line in a book. I don't know. Those are great questions, James. I don't think that there is one most. No, I don't think that there is one most powerful line. I think there's a few. There's always a handful of most powerful lines, and probably one of them comes towards the beginning, one, and then a couple of them somewhere in the middle of that, and then obviously the end. But I feel like along the way, I'm always searching for the most powerful line, and I say to myself, this line is going to stick with me for a while, and it does until I find another line that does
Right.
that, and I'm like, whoa.
Yeah. I can remember more first lines than last lines.
Really
Yeah, I think so.
nice.
Yeah, what
Nice.
about you?
You know what? That's probably true. Also, I can probably remember more first lines. Absolutely. Yeah. What is one of your favorite first lines?
Um, Gosh, if you've read The Meadow by James Galvin,
I haven't. No.
it's wonderful. He's a poet that decided to take a crack at fiction and did a really good job. Yeah, Moby Dick, right? Call Me Ishmael.
Yeah.
Like that's one of the only ones I can think of where there's books written about the first
The
line.
first line. Yeah.
You know,
That's
wild.
That's the iconic first line. Call me Ishmael. Man, we were talking about first lines in my class today too, and it was like, what's funny is first lines, at least for the most part, I'll say, just generalizing here, writers don't come upon the first line as the first line. You don't write the first line in your first line. You know what I mean? You just don't. That's after you've written hundreds of pages and suddenly you go, that is a first line material, right? And you pull that all the way to the front again, and that becomes the first line. And a lot of folks who are at least starting out writing too, we don't realize that. They just kind of think that the first line has to be the greatest line they write. And I'm like, that's not how it works. Your first line's going to just let you just jump into the story, start telling it. You'll figure out the line later. Yeah, for me, it's Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, the opening line of that.
Which
I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember it to a T, but it's like, to the gray country, to part of the red country, the first rains came and it did not cut the scarred earth. It was like a beautiful line. Like, it talks about the division of ideas and all of that in this country, and then it talks about this, how nature comes in and creates a sort of chasm in between the two, and it's like, yeah, love that.
Yeah. The first line of the Galvin is that Galvin writes in The Meadow, is the real world goes like this. Yeah. Oh, it's so good. And he circles back on that enough times that you really start to feel it, and you think about the story of this book like water in an eddy.
Yeah,
it's good.
Yeah, man. You know what? You're right. I think that I absolutely do remember first lines more than I do last lines. So why am I so hung up on last lines then? No,
there's some for a reader. There's some remorse at the end of a good book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's true.
You can finish it and feel sad that it's over.
Yeah.
There's times that I've been reading a book that I've started to read less of it, even though my interest is growing, my connection to the story is growing, because I don't want it to be over.
Yeah.
I
agree.
And I think that there's in writing, there's a lot of fear in, like, how am I gonna put a bow on this? How do I conclude all this? In songs are a classic example of not knowing how to end a song. And that's why so many songs that you listen to just fade out, right? They don't end. They just turn the volume down until you can't hear it anymore.
Dude, that's funny. That's true. You're right. I wish we could just turn the volume down on the book, right?
just
fade out.
Just make the ink a little bit more
just
faint
lighter,
as
lighter,
you go. And
fade
people are
out.
like, what the hell?
The book just ended, faded out. Yeah.
That'd be so annoying.
Yeah, man. Oh, man. You know, one of the most powerful endings for a book was not words at all, but images. And it's in Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, where the character is, I don't know if you've read it, but the character is this little boy who's trying to find out the clues. So he believes that his father was probably the falling man in 9/11 and in the Twin Towers, that his father was the one falling. But because as a kid growing up, his father always played these sort of games where he'd leave him little like clues and that kind of like little scavenger hunt kind of things, you know, and he'd leave him clues around. So the boy wants to believe that, because his father is killed in the Twin Towers, but he wants to believe that the falling man is his dad. So the whole book, he's trying to figure out the clues, or he's hoping the falling man isn't his dad. That's right. Because he's trying to think, my dad's still alive? I got to find the clues. So he's going all over the city of New York trying to find these clues, ashes in a box or keys, a bunch of keys, to find out. He thinks his dad's playing a game and he wants to find his dad alive. But this whole time he's got this eye on this haunting image of the falling man, and he's praying it's not his dad. He's like, I hope it's not my dad. So the book comes all the way to the very end, and the boy has this little monologue, and he's talking about how he wishes he could just rewind time, how he wishes he could hear his dad's words. And he's talking about rewinding time, and then the final image is the image of the man falling out of the building, and then you flip the page and you flip the page and you flip it, and the man starts to float upward across the page back into it's a beautiful ending. It's incredible. And I thought, man, that is powerful. Yeah, where you're just kind of doing a flip book at the end, but it's that monologue leading up to that moment that the man starts to float up. It's powerful, man. Yeah.
I hate it when they put pictures in the middle of a book. Right? And
yeah, well,
I understand like the physical reason why it occurs, but a lot of times we haven't gotten to that part of the story yet.
Oh man, I know. Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I know what you're saying. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, where they're showing you like family images and all that, and you're like, I'm not even there yet.
Yeah. Oh, so he lives. All right.
Yeah, they ruined the whole thing, man. I agree 100%. You know, I use a lot of images in this next book that's coming out of mine, which is the continuation of the plane crash story. This is a little bit of a different approach to it, but I use images, but I also use images very intentionally in the way that, like, I'm going to mess a little bit with the mystery. I'm going to show you a picture and make you want to know like more about it. And then I'm going to tell you about these pictures, but not show you the picture. Like, you know, so I kind of play with that whole idea because I agree that's always happens. I'm like, why are people just sticking a bunch of pictures in the middle of a book? The story's not even done yet. I'm not even there yet, you know, and it's like there's like almost no attention to the storytelling aspect of that. You know?
And it's just mechanical, right? Like that's the place that, you know, whoever's printing this thing can slam all those pictures together. And like, I get it. Just wish they wouldn't do it.
Yeah, no, I agree, man. I agree. And, you know, I'm even kind of one of those people who I don't, you know, because my publisher originally in this conversation was like, well, what if we just put all the pictures at the back? You know, I'm like, I don't like that either because it's too easy to flip to the back and look at the pictures. Like, I'm going to sprinkle them out. I'm going to weave them into the story, make them a part of it, make people work for that image. By the time they get to it, then it's like, that's good. I needed to see that then. That's the idea. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. When you're dead and gone and there's a tombstone over your grave, what is something that you've written that you would want somebody to come and set on that tombstone?
I don't think I want anything written that I've written on my tombstone.
Would it be something that somebody else has written?
I don't know, man. That's a good question. No, I don't think I want something anybody else wrote either on my tombstone. You know what I want my tombstone to say, man, more than anything? I just wanted to say he was a good dad.
Yeah.
That's it.
That'd be great.
I'll win in life if that's what my tombstone
That's
says.
a big accomplishment.
I feel like a winner, man.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
More than anything. My books, all that, cool, man. That's cool. You can say what you want about it, but if my kids can just look at me and have some respect for what I've done as a dad, then I'm good. That's all I need, yeah.
Where can people find the things that you've written?
Anywhere, online, anywhere. Bookstores will have it.
Yeah.
I haven't. My last book was published 7 years ago, so a lot of the stuff is probably not on shelves right now. You can order it though anywhere through any online website.
Do you have a website where they can order it from you directly or anything?
I do, yeah. If you go to my website, timzhernandez.com, timzhernandez.com, you'll find links to my books there, and if you just click on the book, it'll take you right to where you can order the book.
Nice.
Right, very easily. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
And we'll put a link for that in the podcast description to make it a little bit easier for folks.
Awesome. And appreciate you chatting with me at such short notice and being out here. It's great.
Oh, my pleasure. Last question.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to yourself in 2010 as you started on this specific journey that we've been talking about?
Like to my 2010 self?
Yeah.
I would say relax, Tim, with the paranoia. This is your story to tell. It's your story to tell. Like, let go of all the worries and the other external noise. You were meant to tell this story. Tell it.
Do you think you could have heard that advice?
I would have heard it. I would have wanted to believe it. Don't think I would have believed it. Yeah.
Right.
That's the truth. Yeah. Don't think I would have listened to it.
Yeah.
I'm the kind of person who, for better or worse, I got to experience something on my own. You know?
Yeah. I mean, story goes, when the student's ready, the teacher appears, right? And a lot of times we're just not, even if all of that advice or information or counseling is available, if we're not ready for it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. If we're not ready for it, that's exactly it. And I love that quote. Heard that one a long time ago and felt, yep, man, that is so true.
Yeah.
The student is ready, the teacher appears. And man, I wish I had, when I was starting it all in 2010, it was a new beast altogether from what I had been writing prior to that. Everything I wrote prior to that came out of my own imagination. It wasn't about other people. The moment it became about other people, there was a lot of noise around it. People contacting me. I wasn't, and it got me to this place of media contacting me because it was like a famous song that nobody ever heard this mystery. And now you're breaking it open, and it was like, I had so much noise. I started to become distrustful, got in fights with friends that I felt close to. It was just a weird situation in my life, and it came because of my own paranoias around the story. It's almost like the way a friend of mine put it later on, years later. She said, it's like the ghosts of the story were there to haunt you into shape, haunt you to get you to a point where you realize, shit, am I going to do this or, am I just going to back away from it? But it's not going to be easy. And I chose to move forward with it, but it was kind of a weird situation. Never felt anything like that before. Never went through it.
Do you perform well under pressure?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think I do. Yeah. Better under pressure than, yeah.
I'm going to put some pressure on you. You ready?
Okay, sure.
Okay. Speak the last line of the podcast.
Here's what I've learned from everything. A single story that we share with another person can be medicine. But I think that when we can share stories in community with others, then we have a potential for transformation.
I just want to take a second and thank everyone who's written a review, who has sent mail, who's sent emails, who's sent messages. Your support is incredible. And I also love running into you at trade shows and events and just out on the hillside when we're hunting. I think that that's fantastic. I hope you guys keep adventuring as hard and as often as you can. Art for the Six Ranch podcast was created by John Chatelain and was digitized by Celia Harlander. Original music was written and performed by Justin Hay, and the Six Ranch podcast is now produced by Six Ranch Media. Thank you all so much for your continued support of the show, and I look forward to next week when we can bring you a brand new episode.